My name is Selene Aragon. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have lived as the forgotten one in my own family. They never had to say it directly. Their silence, their cold glances, the way my name was left off invitations or group messages, it all told me the same story. I wasn't meant to belong. I grew up watching cousins receive everything: the gifts, the recognition, the promise of inheriting a legacy built long before any of us were born. And I stood on the sidelines, as if my presence were an inconvenience they simply tolerated. What none of them ever imagined was that the will they were counting on to secure their futures would be the very thing to expose who I truly was. Before I tell you how I went from invisible shadow to rightful heir, do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Because if you've ever been pushed aside or made to feel small by the very people who should have protected you, my story will strike a chord with you. For years, I pretended I was fine with being overlooked. I told myself it didn't matter when family vacations were planned without me. I brushed it off when cousins unwrapped extravagant gifts while I was handed something thoughtless and cheap. I convinced myself those were only details, but deep down, I knew they were more than that. They were constant reminders that in their eyes I had no worth, no claim, no seat at the table. One particular gathering still haunts me. They were dividing investments aloud, speaking of inheritances and shares, while I sat right there in the room. Nobody paused, nobody included me, as if my silence had been agreed upon long ago. It wasn't only about money, it was about erasure. That night, I left with a promise to myself. I would never again let their indifference define who I was. But the truth has a strange way of surfacing. When my grandfather, the patriarch who held the family fortune with an iron grip, passed away, I assumed nothing would change. His empire of land and companies would be neatly divided among the chosen, and I would once again be left with nothing. They didn't even think to invite me to the will reading. To them, my absence was natural. But something inside me refused to accept that role. Pride, maybe defiance, made me walk into that room, uninvited. That decision altered everything. The day my grandfather's will was read was the day their carefully crafted facade shattered, and for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes instead of disdain. The Aragon family was not just wealthy. They were entrenched in a culture of hierarchy so rigid it could suffocate anyone who didn't fit neatly inside its lines. From the outside, we probably looked enviable. Old estates, sprawling properties, a name that carried weight in certain circles. But on the inside, it was a system designed to elevate a few and erase the rest. And in that system, I had been marked as unnecessary. The roles were established early. My cousins were the golden children, the heirs the family spoke of with pride, the ones paraded at every event as proof of how the Aragon bloodline produced brilliance. One of them was described as a prodigy for mastering piano at 8 years old, another praised for scoring in the top percentile on standardized tests, and yet another was celebrated simply for being handsome and charming in a way that seemed to open doors before he ever tried. At every family gathering, accomplishments were stacked like trophies on a shelf, each cousin receiving recognition in front of everyone. I was never part of those conversations. At best, I was a footnote, mentioned briefly in a tone that carried no pride, only obligation. I would overhear my aunts remark that I was quiet, or that I was trying, words that landed like insults dressed as politeness. Sometimes they wouldn't mention me at all. I learned quickly that invisibility was my assigned role. The hierarchy wasn't only about recognition, it extended to the smallest details of daily life. At family dinners, seating arrangements were deliberate. The cousins who carried the future of the name were placed near the center, beside the patriarch, their voices heard and encouraged. I, on the other hand, was often left at the far end of the table, surrounded by chairs that filled last, where I could be forgotten without anyone noticing. Even as a child, I recognized the message in those placements. Proximity to power was earned, and I had not earned it. Holidays magnified the imbalance. The others received expensive watches, brand-name clothes, or travel vouchers as if luxury were their birthright. I was given things that felt more like obligations than gifts. A notebook bought in bulk, a scarf that seemed like it had been an afterthought, or worse, something used, passed down under the guise of sentiment. I pretended not to care, but every time I unwrapped one of those items, I felt the sting of their quiet dismissal. It was not the object itself. It was the reminder that I was worth less in their eyes. Exclusion was also practical. Trips to Europe or family retreats at beach houses were planned openly, discussed with excitement while I sat in the room, only to realize later that I had never been considered part of the guest list. I used to wonder if they forgot me accidentally, but over time I realized it was intentional. My absence simplified their world, kept the family image clean. I was the blemish they could erase with ease. The psychological toll of this hierarchy was heavy. I grew up learning to read silences better than words. I could sense when a conversation was shifting towards something that excluded me and quietly excuse myself before the sting became too obvious. I trained myself to celebrate my own accomplishments privately because I knew they would never receive recognition publicly. When I graduated with honors, my mother clapped, but my achievement barely made it into the family chatter. Meanwhile, when one of my cousins received an internship, an opportunity handed to him through connections rather than merit, the entire table toasted to his hard work. I learned to live in two worlds, the one they dictated, where I was invisible, and the one I built in my own head, where I kept small victories alive. That dual existence shaped me more than I realized at the time. I became resilient, self-sufficient, someone who didn't beg for approval because I knew it would never come. But the cost of that resilience was loneliness. The family's structure thrived on comparisons. They didn't just celebrate success, they weaponized it. Aunts and uncles would remark that one cousin's career path was admirable, while another's university acceptance was proof of the Aragon legacy. When they glanced at me, the silence that followed was louder than any criticism. The lack of acknowledgement became a shadow I carried everywhere, as if I were constantly reminded that my bloodline wasn't enough to guarantee me a place in their narrative. Looking back, I realized they needed me in that position. Every family needs an example of what not to be, someone who makes the others shine brighter in comparison. That was my role. My failure, or what they perceived as failure, validated their success. My absence at their events made their gatherings cleaner, their photographs more presentable, their legacy more intact. I was the family's unspoken cautionary tale, even if I had done nothing wrong but exist. Still, in the quiet moments, I could feel something shifting inside me. For every act of exclusion, I built a layer of resolve. For every slight, I stored away the memory as proof of who they really were. By the time I reached adulthood, I had a mental archive of all the ways I had been erased, and though I didn't yet know how or when, I carried a certainty that one day those memories would matter. One day, I would no longer be silent. At the time, though, I stayed in my assigned role, playing the outsider while the others basked in their borrowed spotlight. They were convinced the future was theirs, that the inheritance was already carved out for them. And maybe I believed it too, until the day came when the will was read, and every carefully stacked piece of their hierarchy crumbled. The most painful parts of being erased were never the big events. It wasn't the family vacations I was left out of, or the inheritance conversations whispered as if I weren't sitting right there. Those were obvious. I could brace myself for those moments. What cut deeper were the smaller humiliations, the ones woven into everyday life, so subtle they could almost pass as normal. Almost. They were the kind of wounds that didn't bleed right away but left scars all the same. Take birthdays, for example. My cousins' milestones were treated like royal occasions. Their 16th birthdays came with rented halls, live bands, and professional photographers to capture every polished moment. When it was my turn, there was a cake on the kitchen counter, a card signed with mechanical words, and the reminder that not every child needed extravagance. I tried to be grateful. I told myself it was better than nothing. But watching the others glow under chandeliers while I blew out candles under the flicker of a single dim bulb etched the difference into my bones. Even in school, the contrast followed me. My cousins arrived in new cars before they had even mastered parking, each one gifted without question. I commuted on buses, clutching a worn-out backpack, trying not to let envy consume me. The message was clear. They were investments, worth equipping with every advantage. I was an afterthought, expected to make do. And while no one ever said it outright, I could hear the unspoken sentiment in the way they looked at me. My struggles were seen as proof of my place in the hierarchy, as if my lack of luxury validated their superiority. Holidays magnified the humiliation. At Christmas, tables groaned under the weight of expensive gifts. Wrapping paper shimmered, brand names flashed, and laughter filled the air as they compared who had received what. When my turn came, I learned to steel my face, to accept something like a scented candle or a discounted scarf with a smile that hid the sting. It wasn't about the object. It was about the performance of generosity. They wanted me to know they had remembered me, but not in the way that mattered. It was never thoughtful, never personal, never chosen with care. Just a gesture, a box checked, another way to remind me I was included only out of obligation. There were group photos too. Endless group photos. At weddings, christenings, and annual gatherings, the family lined up in neat rows while photographers clicked away. I was there, of course, always on the edge of the frame. When the pictures were printed or shared, I noticed how easily I could be cropped out, how naturally my absence seemed to fit. It was as if I were never meant to be in the picture at all. Over time, I started to step back voluntarily, blending into the background before they could push me there. It became easier to disappear on my own terms than to feel the sting of being pushed aside. What made it worse was the way they disguised exclusion as concern. If I wasn't invited to a dinner, I was told later that they thought I might be too busy or that I wouldn't enjoy the company. When I was left out of a trip, I was told it was because they didn't want me to feel burdened by the costs. These excuses dripped with false kindness, the type that made it impossible to confront them without looking ungrateful. And so I swallowed it all, their casual cruelty hidden behind polite smiles. One memory remains sharper than the rest. It was at a family reunion where my uncle raised his glass to toast the future of the Aragon name. He went around the table, naming each cousin and praising their accomplishments. One was studying law, another had just gotten engaged, another was preparing to join the family business. When his glass lowered, I realized he had skipped me entirely. My mother nudged him lightly, and he gave a half-hearted nod in my direction, muttering that I was making my way. That was all. 2 words, barely audible, meant to cover the omission. In that moment, I felt my entire existence summed up as a footnote, a filler between names that mattered. The subtle humiliations shaped me in ways I didn't understand until much later. They taught me how to shrink myself, how to disappear without being asked, how to anticipate rejection before it arrived. I built walls so high that I almost forgot what it felt like to be seen. And yet, behind those walls, I stored everything. Every slight, every forgotten invitation, every gift that carried no thought. I kept them like artifacts, proof of a truth nobody else wanted to acknowledge. I often wondered what hurt more, the cruelty itself or the fact that nobody else seemed to notice. My cousins never stopped to ask why I was always at the margins, why I never had the same opportunities. To them, the system was natural. They thrived in it. So why question it? My mother stayed silent too, perhaps out of fear of rocking the fragile peace she clung to. That silence was another kind of betrayal, quieter, but heavier. Looking back, I see now that those humiliations were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of erasure, designed to remind me of my place. And though I didn't yet know it, each one was preparing me for the day when I would stand in that room, facing them all, and watch the facade collapse. The Aragon fortune was never just about wealth. It was about identity, belonging, and power. From the time I was a child, I understood that money in my family was more than currency. It was a language, a hierarchy, and a weapon. The fortune was spoken of in hushed tones and proud declarations, often in the same breath. It was their crown jewel, the reason the family name meant something in certain circles, the anchor that held together their sense of superiority. Every story seemed to circle back to it. Family gatherings weren't complete without some uncle reminding us of how far the Aragons had come, or a cousin boasting about what they would inherit one day. They didn't just talk about the businesses or the land. They glorified the legacy itself, the idea that their worth as people was somehow inseparable from the empire built generations before. As if the fortune itself was proof of their virtue. I always knew my place in that narrative. I wasn't the heir. I wasn't the prodigy. I wasn't the one whose name would be tied to companies or estates. I was the shadow at the edge of the conversation, listening as they planned futures that had no room for me. When they spoke of the fortune, they didn't speak of it as a shared legacy. It was a prize they distributed among themselves, passing around titles and claims like cards in a game. My absence from those discussions was deliberate, as if they were ensuring the rules were clear. The fortune was theirs, and mine was only the knowledge that it would never be mine. The businesses themselves carried a mythical status. There was the original textile company that had funded the first waves of wealth, though it now existed mostly as a holding on paper. Then there were the vineyards, sprawling and picturesque, more a symbol than a source of revenue, yet still spoken of as proof of culture and refinement. And the land, miles of it, estates with iron gates, summer houses that stood empty most of the year, properties that existed not for use but for prestige. They represented permanence, a message to the world that the Aragons were untouchable. At family dinners, my cousins boasted about how they would one day manage these assets. One was already shadowing a manager at the vineyard. Another was being prepped to take a seat on the board of the holding company. They treated it as a rite of passage, as if competence were inherited along with the wealth. None of them worried about whether they deserved it, whether they had earned it. They simply knew it was theirs. I often sat silently, listening to these conversations, feeling as though the fortune wasn't just a wall between us, it was a mirror reflecting my exclusion. The fortune had another purpose too. It was used as leverage to control behavior. Approval meant access. If a cousin made a choice that pleased the family, opportunities appeared. Funding for education, a car, a generous allowance. If someone stepped out of line, the threat of being cut off lingered in the air. It was never spoken directly, but everyone knew. Money wasn't just given, it was dangled like a promise, withdrawn like a punishment. And I, already on the margins, was proof of what happened when the family deemed someone unworthy. I was the cautionary tale, the living example of what it meant to exist without the safety net of Aragon wealth. What stung the most was not the lack of money itself. I had learned to survive, to build a life with what little I had. What hurt was the way they used the fortune to define worth. A cousin who squandered opportunities was still praised because of his place in the line of inheritance. I, who had worked tirelessly to stand on my own, was dismissed because I had no claim to their treasure chest. In their eyes, money validated every action, excused every flaw, elevated every mediocrity. Without it, no achievement of mine mattered. I remember one family gathering where the patriarch, my grandfather, sat at the head of the table, his voice steady, his presence commanding. He spoke of the fortune not as numbers on a balance sheet, but as something sacred, something that bound us together. He described it as the blood of the Aragon name, the legacy that ensured we would never be ordinary. The others nodded solemnly, drinking in his words like scripture. I sat there, staring at the tablecloth, knowing that his speech did not include me. The blood of the Aragon name was not something I was allowed to claim, even though it ran just as surely through my veins. Over time, the fortune became a ghost that haunted me. It was always present, hovering in conversations, dictating the way people treated me, determining who mattered and who didn't. I couldn't touch it, couldn't claim it, couldn't even pretend it might someday be mine. And yet it shaped my life more than anything else. My exclusion wasn't about me as a person, it was about what I represented. I was the one left outside the circle of wealth, the one who proved that the fortune wasn't for everyone, even within the same bloodline. The irony is that the more they used the fortune to elevate themselves, the more hollow it all became. Behind the polished smiles and rehearsed pride, there was constant competition, jealousy simmering beneath the surface. Who would inherit the most? Who would control the companies? Who would gain the favor of the patriarch before he was gone? They fought for approval, for recognition, for proximity to money as if it were oxygen. And I, excluded as I was, watched from the margins with a strange mix of pain and clarity. I saw the cracks in their golden world. I saw the desperation hidden behind their arrogance. At the time, I thought the fortune would never touch me. It wasn't mine to consider, wasn't mine to hope for. But I carried the weight of it anyway, because being excluded from something so central meant being excluded from the family itself. I didn't realize then that the very fortune they used to erase me would one day become the key to my revelation. There comes a moment when silence becomes unbearable. For me, it wasn't a single insult or a particular gift that felt like an afterthought. It wasn't even the countless times my name was missing from invitations. It was something quieter, but heavier. The breaking point came at a family reunion, one of those carefully orchestrated gatherings where every detail was meant to reinforce the image of strength, unity, and legacy. The Aragons loved to perform unity, even as they thrived on hierarchy. I remember walking into the hall that day, the tables set with precision, every glass polished until it gleamed. My cousins moved through the space like royalty, confident, knowing exactly where to sit, how to laugh at the right moments, how to showcase themselves as the future of the family. I, as always, hovered on the margins, trying to convince myself it didn't matter. But then the conversation turned, as it always did, to the fortune. It wasn't unusual. Money was the glue that held them together and the unspoken contract that kept everyone performing their roles. They began dividing futures aloud, speaking casually of properties, companies, and shares as if they were simply arranging place settings. Names were mentioned, responsibilities assigned, blessings given. I sat there, listening, my plate untouched, my presence unnoticed. They carried on as though I were invisible. It wasn't the first time. But that day, something in me cracked. Perhaps it was the way one of my aunts laughed as she predicted how a cousin would one day oversee the vineyards, or how another would take control of the board. Perhaps it was the way my grandfather's name was invoked, his vision used as a weapon to secure their entitlement. Or maybe it was just the silence that followed, the lack of pause, the absence of my name. Not even a mention, not even a dismissive acknowledgement. I was erased in real time, right there in the room, erased in front of everyone, and nobody noticed. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment but from a rage that had been building quietly for years. For the first time, I didn't try to swallow it. I didn't tell myself it was fine or that I was stronger than their cruelty. I let myself feel it. I let the injustice burn. I realized that this wasn't just about money or opportunities. It was about dignity. It was about existence. They weren't just denying me wealth. They were denying me identity. On the way home that night, I sat in silence, the city lights blurring past the car window. I replayed the moment over and over, the laughter, the casual division of what they assumed would be theirs, the emptiness where my name should have been. It was as though the family had built a stage, and I was forced to watch from behind the curtain, never allowed to step into the light. That night, I promised myself that if I couldn't have their acceptance, I would have something else. I would have truth. I would have my own power, even if it came from standing alone. It was the first time I truly understood that survival wasn't enough. For years, I had trained myself to endure, to live in the shadows, to collect the scraps of acknowledgement they threw at me. But endurance is not the same as living. That night I decided I would no longer be content with survival. I didn't yet know what that meant, or how it would manifest, but I felt something shift inside me. Looking back, I see that moment as the beginning, the point where silence turned into resolve, the day I stopped accepting the erasure and started preparing, even unknowingly, for the moment when their world would collide with mine. They thought they were dividing an inheritance. They had no idea they were feeding the fire that would one day expose the truth. When my grandfather died, I assumed I would grieve in my own quiet way. Not because we had been close. He had always been a man of distance and formality. But because his presence had been a constant, immovable, like the heavy gates that surrounded the family estate. His death was the kind of event that shook the Aragon family to its core, not because of love, but because of what it meant. The fortune was now in motion, waiting to be divided. I wasn't invited to the reading of the will. That didn't surprise me. Invitations went out to the golden ones, the heirs who had been groomed for years. Their names carried weight. Mine did not. They assumed I wouldn't come, that I would know my place, stay in the shadows as I always had. But something inside me refused to accept that silence anymore. I told myself it was pride or stubbornness or maybe even desperation, but whatever it was, it pushed me to dress carefully that morning, to walk into the law office uninvited, and to sit among them as if I belonged. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The walls were lined with shelves of thick legal volumes, the kind that seemed designed to intimidate. My cousins gathered in clusters, whispering with the easy confidence of people certain of their place. Aunts and uncles exchanged tight smiles, their eyes flicking toward me with a mix of annoyance and disbelief. My presence unsettled them, though none dared to say it out loud. I sat near the back, my hands folded in my lap, my heartbeat steady but heavy. The lawyer, a man whose face seemed carved from stone, began with the usual formalities. His voice was dry, deliberate, every word carrying the weight of decades. He read clauses about properties, about the distribution of estates, about shares in companies. Names were spoken with reverence. My cousins, my uncles, my aunts. Each mention drew nods, satisfied glances, small smiles of victory. My name was absent, as expected, but then something shifted. The lawyer paused, his eyes scanning a separate folder that had been set aside. The room stilled, the air thick with anticipation. He explained that there was an addendum, sealed years earlier, to be opened only upon my grandfather's death. Murmurs rippled through the room. Even my cousins leaned forward, curiosity etched into their smug faces. When he broke the seal and pulled out the documents, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just another clause or minor adjustment. His tone carried a weight I hadn't heard before. He said my grandfather had left specific instructions regarding a matter that had been kept private for decades. The words felt foreign, almost scripted, but I caught the way his eyes flicked toward me before he continued. He began to read. My grandfather had acknowledged me, not as a distant relative, not as an afterthought, but as blood, legal blood. The papers revealed letters, agreements, even affidavits that confirmed what no one had ever dared to say aloud. I was not the outsider they believed me to be. I was not the mistake they tolerated. I was his child. His recognition of me had been documented and sealed, hidden away until this moment. The silence in the room was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just quiet. It was stunned, hollow, as though the air itself had been sucked out. Faces shifted from smugness to shock, from annoyance to disbelief. My cousins, who had once looked at me with condescension, now stared as if seeing me for the first time. My aunt's painted smiles faltered. My uncle's confident postures slumped. Even my mother, sitting rigid in her chair, looked at me with eyes that betrayed a storm of emotions. Fear, shame, perhaps even relief. The lawyer read further. My grandfather had not only acknowledged me, he had secured provisions in the will that could not be contested. Assets, properties, and shares had been set aside explicitly in my name. It wasn't a token gesture, it was a statement. A declaration that I belonged, that I was part of the legacy they had tried to erase me from. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had spent my entire life convincing myself that I didn't care, that their exclusion didn't matter, that I was strong enough to live outside their world. And yet, hearing my name spoken in that room, etched into the will of the man who had defined our family, felt like vindication I hadn't even known I was craving. The murmurs began again, louder now, angry, confused. Questions spilled into the silence, though they weren't addressed to me. How could this be? Why had this been hidden? What did it mean for the distribution? The golden ones, so used to certainty, suddenly looked fragile, their entitlement cracking under the weight of truth. I sat still, my hands trembling only slightly in my lap. For years, they had erased me, diminished me, treated me as a ghost. And now, in the span of a few pages, the ghost had become undeniable. My existence was written in ink they couldn't erase, signed and sealed by the man they had worshipped as patriarch. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The power of silence, for once, was mine. Their own arrogance had written the script, and the truth had finally forced its way into the open. That day, in that suffocating room, I realized that everything had shifted. The fortune they guarded so carefully was no longer theirs alone. And more importantly, the story they had told about me, the outsider, the unwanted one, was shattered. The lawyer's voice did not tremble, but I could feel the weight of every word as he continued to read the sealed addendum. The letters were detailed, handwritten by my grandfather himself, leaving no room for denial or manipulation. He described me not as a mistake, not as an accident, but as his blood, his responsibility, and, this part nearly knocked the air from my lungs, his daughter in every sense of the word. He admitted that he had failed to make this known publicly during his lifetime, fearing the collapse of the carefully crafted image of the family, but he stated clearly that truth was more important than pride. The moment those words left the lawyer's lips, the entire room seemed to fracture. Gasps broke the silence, chairs scraped against the polished floor, whispers darted between relatives who had never lowered their voices before. For decades, they had convinced themselves that I was on the margins by design. Now they were being told that the margins never existed, that the line between them and me had been erased by the very man who defined their worth. I sat there, still, almost frozen. My body didn't move, but my mind roared. The words echoed in my head: daughter, responsibility, inheritance. It felt unreal, like I was watching a play unfold, except I was no longer the audience hidden in the shadows. I was on stage, center, undeniable. The lawyer read through the documents methodically, outlining the assets placed in my name. A portion of the vineyards, shares in the holding company, and a property that I had never even set foot in, but that had been preserved with me in mind. It wasn't just symbolic. These were not scraps or gestures. These were substantial, meaningful, undeniable. I caught the faces around me, and each one told its own story. One cousin's face flushed red, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Another cousin stared at me with wide eyes, her shock mingled with something else. Fear, maybe jealousy, maybe both. My aunts whispered furiously among themselves, their voices low but sharp, like daggers hidden behind silk scarves. My uncles avoided my gaze, their eyes fixed on the lawyer's papers, as though reading them silently could undo what had already been spoken aloud. And then there was my mother. Her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She looked at me not with shock. She had known, or at least suspected, but with something heavier. Guilt, perhaps. The weight of years of silence, of allowing me to live erased, even though she must have carried this truth like a stone in her chest. For a brief second, I thought she might speak, might claim the moment to confirm what the papers revealed. But she stayed silent, letting the lawyer's words do what she had never dared to. The lawyer paused, his gaze sweeping the room before closing the folder. His voice, steady as ever, declared that the provisions were legally binding and not open to dispute. The patriarch had left no ambiguity, no loophole, no chance for anyone to twist the meaning. I had been written into the legacy as firmly as the golden heirs had been groomed to claim it. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. It wasn't the silence of dismissal I had grown used to. It was the silence of impact, of realization, of people suddenly confronted with a truth they couldn't erase. For years, they had looked at me as though I were less. Now they had to face the fact that I was not only equal, but in some ways positioned above them. I could feel their eyes on me, burning, measuring, recalculating. The air was heavy with unspoken words: betrayal, anger, disbelief. All of it pulsed through the room like a storm just beginning to break. One cousin muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone but those nearest to hear, but I caught the tone. Disdain mixed with fear. He couldn't believe it, couldn't accept it. My aunts exchanged looks sharp enough to slice through the air, their perfectly groomed faces contorted with something ugly, something they could no longer disguise with politeness. I didn't move. I didn't need to. For once, their frantic whispers and restless shifting were not my problem. The truth was not a performance I had to beg them to see. It had been written, sealed, delivered by the only voice they respected, my grandfather's. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt solid, undeniable, rooted in a place they couldn't push me out of. And as I sat there, I realized something almost intoxicating. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to fight, didn't need to scream. Their faces, their silence, their unraveling, that was the victory. What struck me most was how quickly their arrogance crumbled. These were people who had built entire identities on the certainty of inheritance, who had treated wealth as proof of superiority. In a single moment, all of that certainty dissolved. They were forced to see me not as the shadow they had crafted, but as a mirror reflecting their own cruelty. And the reflection was unbearable to them. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but I stopped myself. My whole life had been spent filling in the blanks, justifying my place, defending my existence. For once, I didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than I ever could. As I left the lawyer's office that day, the corridor felt different under my steps. I had walked in uninvited, as the forgotten one, the outsider. I walked out as Celine Aragon, daughter of the patriarch, rightful heir. And though the family had always defined power in terms of money, I realized my true inheritance wasn't just material. It was the dismantling of their lie, the reclamation of my identity. There are moments in life when time seems to stretch, when every second feels heavier than the last, pressing against your chest until it's hard to breathe. That was what it felt like in the law office after the lawyer finished reading the addendum to my grandfather's will. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, saturated with disbelief, rage, humiliation, and fear. The faces around me were masks cracking in real time. My cousins, who had always worn their entitlement like a crown, now looked as though the ground beneath them had shifted. Their smirks were gone, replaced with clenched jaws and darting eyes. They avoided looking at me directly, but I felt their stares land like blows, sharp and accusing. For years, they had treated me as invisible, and now they couldn't stop seeing me. One of my uncles leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. I had seen that same man give speeches about the importance of legacy, how the Aragon name carried weight, how it was our duty to preserve it. Now he looked like someone whose script had been stolen mid-performance. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing at the lawyer as if the messenger could be blamed for the message. The whispers began almost immediately. My aunts huddled together, their voices low but laced with venom. I didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. They were already spinning stories in their heads, searching for explanations, excuses, any narrative that could make sense of what they had just heard. To admit the truth meant admitting that they had been wrong about me all along, and I knew that was something they would never do willingly. One cousin, the one who had always been groomed as the heir apparent, slammed his hand against the table. The sound made everyone flinch, even the lawyer, who until that moment had been a pillar of composure. He demanded to know how this could be possible, how decades of certainty could unravel with a single set of documents. His voice trembled with outrage, but underneath it, I heard something else. Fear. Fear that the future he had been promised his entire life had just been stolen out from under him. Another cousin turned to me, her face pale, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Her eyes, once filled with condescension whenever they landed on me, now looked almost desperate. She seemed to be calculating, trying to decide whether I was an enemy to fight or an ally to appease. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I sat in silence, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression calm. For once, I wasn't the one scrambling to justify myself. My mother sat rigid, her posture betraying the storm inside her. She had known, at least in fragments, though she had never spoken it aloud. I wondered if she had expected this day, if she had carried the secret with both relief and dread, waiting for it to surface. Her eyes darted between me and the others, guilt etched into every line of her face. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, as though the truth had not only freed me, but diminished her. The lawyer cleared his throat, reminding everyone that the provisions were final and binding. His words sliced through the whispers, restoring a temporary order. He explained that my grandfather had left explicit instructions to ensure my position could not be contested, anticipating resistance from the rest of the family. He even referenced legal battles he had seen in other dynasties, noting that my grandfather had gone out of his way to avoid such chaos. That detail seemed to infuriate them even more. The patriarch they had worshipped, the man whose approval they had chased, had not only included me but had protected me from their inevitable backlash. In doing so, he had revealed a truth none of them could spin away. The room erupted again. My uncle demanded to see the original letters. My aunt asked how this had remained hidden for so long. A cousin muttered that it must be a forgery, that there had to be some mistake. Their voices overlapped, a chorus of denial and desperation. The lawyer remained calm, repeating that the documents were authentic, notarized, sealed, and legally sound. Every protest fell flat against his steady tone, but that didn't stop them from trying. I sat there, absorbing it all. For years, I had been the one shrinking under their scrutiny, the one trying to explain, to prove, to justify. Now I didn't have to say a word. Their panic spoke for itself. Their faces revealed everything. The arrogance they had built their lives on had been cracked open, and the truth was seeping in whether they liked it or not. One cousin finally broke the silence directed at me. His words were laced with contempt, calling me opportunistic, suggesting I had manipulated my way into this outcome. The accusation didn't sting, it almost made me laugh. How could I have manipulated something I hadn't even known existed? But I didn't answer. I didn't rise to defend myself. I let the absurdity of his words hang in the air, unsupported, collapsing under its own weight. What struck me most in that moment wasn't their anger. It was their fear. They weren't just angry that I had been included. They were terrified of what it meant. My existence as an heir didn't just add another name to the list. It rearranged the entire structure. It meant the shares they had counted on were smaller. It meant the influence they believed was theirs alone was now diluted. It meant the hierarchy they had spent decades reinforcing was no longer valid. And the person they had treated as expendable was now sitting at the table with more claim than some of them. As the chaos swirled around me, I felt something unexpected. Calm. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't shrinking, I wasn't burning with rage. I was steady, as though I had been waiting for this moment all my life. Maybe I had. Every slight, every exclusion, every humiliation had prepared me for this. Their disbelief was my vindication. Their panic was my revenge. The lawyer eventually closed the folder and announced that the reading was over. His tone left no room for further debate, though I could see in their eyes that the battle had only just begun. As we stood, the air in the room was thick with hostility. No one spoke to me directly, but their glares said enough. They saw me now, not as a ghost, but as a threat. And for the first time, I didn't feel erased. I felt powerful. Their shock was my inheritance, and I wore it like armor. Revenge doesn't always come with fire and fury. Sometimes the sweetest form of it is silence. To sit still while those who mocked you unravel in their own arrogance. That was my reality after the reading of the will. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't try to prove myself. I simply existed, and my existence was enough to shake the ground beneath them. When I walked out of that office, I felt a strange calm, like stepping out into cool air after being trapped in a suffocating room. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility. Now, the burden was theirs. They couldn't look at me without seeing the truth written across their own shame. And the beauty of it was that I didn't have to lift a finger. Their downfall was self-inflicted. In the weeks that followed, the shockwaves rippled through every corner of the family. My phone buzzed constantly with messages, some laced with thinly veiled threats, others dripping with false warmth. Cousins who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted to meet for coffee. Aunts who had dismissed me as irrelevant now sent carefully worded notes asking if we could talk privately. They weren't reaching out because they cared. They were scrambling to contain their own losses. Each attempt was a negotiation disguised as reconciliation. I didn't play along. I answered with the same silence they had once used against me. I read their messages and let them sit unanswered. I attended gatherings and spoke only when spoken to, letting the discomfort fester in the air. For years, they had perfected the art of pretending I wasn't there. Now it was my turn to let them feel the sting of irrelevance. The irony was almost poetic. The cousins who had flaunted their privileges, bragged about their futures, now looked at me with unease. They tried to mask it with politeness. But I saw it in their eyes. The calculation, the uncertainty, the awareness that the balance had shifted. For once, they didn't know how to treat me. Was I still the outsider? Or was I now the obstacle standing in the way of what they believed was theirs? One evening, I attended a family dinner out of obligation. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. They tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, speaking of weddings, careers, and vacations. But every sentence faltered, every laugh seemed forced. They avoided the topic of the will, but it lingered in the room like smoke after a fire. And every time their eyes flicked toward me, I knew exactly what they were thinking. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to remind them of the truth. My very presence did that for me. Sitting there, calm and steady, was the loudest declaration I had ever made. The silence I once hated had become my weapon. It was strange to watch them crumble. They had spent years building themselves up, layer after layer of arrogance, convinced of their superiority. And now, in the face of one undeniable truth, that arrogance cracked like glass. They tried to cling to old patterns, to dismiss me, to minimize my significance. But the weight of my name on the will was too heavy. It pressed down on them, suffocating their denial. My mother's behavior shifted too. She spoke less, avoided confrontation, and watched me with a quiet caution. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the knowledge that she had allowed me to suffer in silence all those years while holding a piece of the truth inside her. She wanted to say something. I felt it in her hesitation, in the way her lips parted and then closed again. But I didn't give her the chance. Her silence had cost me too much, and now I wasn't going to make it easy for her to find relief in confession. The most satisfying part wasn't the inheritance itself. Yes, the assets mattered. They represented stability, recognition, a place I had been denied for too long. But the true victory was psychological. Watching them choke on their own cruelty, forced to see me not as the ghost they had erased, but as the equal they could never deny, was more powerful than any fortune. Their discomfort became my liberation. Every interaction from that point forward was tinged with tension. When they praised a cousin's achievement, I noticed how their voices faltered, as if afraid to draw attention to comparisons. When they tried to boast about their lifestyles, their eyes darted toward me, gauging my reaction. They were no longer sure of their footing. The hierarchy that had once been their foundation was gone, and I didn't have to lift a single stone to destroy it. It dawned on me then that revenge isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about absence, about refusing to give them the reactions they expect, the arguments they crave, the explanations they demand. I had nothing to prove. The truth had already spoken for me, and it spoke louder than I ever could. I carried myself differently too. Not with arrogance, not with the same smugness they had shown me, but with quiet assurance. I no longer bent myself smaller to fit their expectations. I no longer avoided eye contact or softened my words. I didn't need to announce my worth. I embodied it. And every time I walked into a room, I could feel their unease. as though my presence alone was a reminder of their defeat. The beauty of it was that I didn't seek to hurt them. I didn't plot revenge, didn't plan out ways to make them suffer. I simply allowed them to sit in the truth they had spent years burying. And the truth was far more punishing than anything I could have orchestrated. Their legacy, their pride, their carefully curated image, all of it had been tainted by the revelation that the one they had tried to erase was not only still here, but stronger than ever. In the end, my revenge wasn't about destroying them. It was about reclaiming myself. It was about standing in the light they had tried to keep me from and realizing that I no longer needed their approval, their acceptance, or their acknowledgement. The silence that once crushed me now lifted me. It became the space where I could finally breathe, finally exist, finally be seen. Not because they allowed it, but because I demanded nothing less. And the irony? They couldn't escape it. Everywhere they turned, I was there, not as a shadow, but as a mirror. A reminder of their cruelty, their arrogance, their failure. My very existence had become the revenge they never saw coming. In the months after the will was read, I learned that true change doesn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It unfolds slowly, in fragments, in the spaces between words and silences. The day my grandfather's secrets were revealed was the earthquake, but what followed were the aftershocks. And sometimes, those aftershocks cut deeper than the initial rupture. The family tried to rebuild itself around the new reality, but the cracks were too wide to hide. Every gathering carried tension, every conversation faltered under the weight of unspoken truths. They smiled tighter, laughed shorter, and measured their words carefully, as though one wrong sentence might expose the bitterness still festering beneath the surface. For the first time, I wasn't the one walking on eggshells. They were. I noticed the small shifts. A cousin who once ignored me now sent messages about staying close as family. An aunt who used to dismiss my career suddenly asked me to explain details about the shares I had inherited, pretending it was curiosity when I knew it was calculation. My uncles avoided direct confrontation, but their sideways glances were full of accusation, as if I had stolen something that was never mine to begin with. They couldn't accept that the theft had been theirs all along. The theft of my existence, my dignity, my right to belong. And my mother? She changed too. She called more often, her voice tentative, heavy with things unsaid. She wanted to explain, to confess, to share the burden she had carried in silence. I let her speak sometimes, but I never gave her the release of forgiveness. Not yet. Her silence had been part of my erasure, and while I understood her fear, I couldn't erase the years I had spent alone in the margins because she hadn't dared to speak the truth. What surprised me most wasn't their behavior. It was my own. For so long, I had imagined that vindication would make me hungry for revenge, that I would want to throw their cruelty back in their faces, to shout every insult I had ever swallowed. But when the moment came, I felt none of that. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to humiliate them as they had humiliated me. My victory was quieter, sharper. It was the simple fact that I existed in the space they had tried to erase, and no amount of denial could undo it. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like survival. Sometimes it looks like peace. And sometimes it looks like walking into a room where everyone once dismissed you, and sitting there, calm, while they choke on their own disbelief. I also learned something about legacy. For them, the Aragon fortune had always been about control. Who had it, who didn't, who deserved it, who didn't. It was a weapon, not a gift. But for me, the inheritance was never about the money. It was about validation. It was proof that my existence wasn't a mistake, that the blood they had tried to deny ran through my veins as surely as theirs. That truth gave me something no amount of wealth ever could: freedom. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't crave their acceptance. I no longer longed for a seat at their table, because I had built my own. The will wasn't just a legal document, it was a mirror, forcing them to see me as I had always been, and forcing me to see myself clearly for the first time. Of course, they still tried to fight it. They whispered about loopholes, consulted lawyers, speculated about ways to diminish my claim. But deep down, they knew the battle was lost. My grandfather had made sure of it. He had written me into the story they had tried to erase, and the ink could not be undone. Sometimes, late at night, I think about him. I wonder why he waited until death to acknowledge me. I wonder if guilt had gnawed at him, if he had intended to speak sooner but lacked the courage. I wonder if part of him had wanted me to earn my strength in silence, to grow in the shadows so that when the truth finally came, I would know exactly how to carry it. I'll never know. But what I do know is this: his silence shaped me, but his final act freed me. Now, when I look back at the years of exclusion, I no longer feel only pain. I feel clarity. They tried to erase me, but in doing so, they forced me to build a resilience they could never understand. They built their worth on inheritance. I built mine on survival. And when the truth finally came, it was me who stood steady while they trembled. That, to me, is the ultimate revenge. Not shouting, not fighting, not tearing them down. Just standing, unshaken, while the empire they thought they controlled crumbles under the weight of a truth they can't escape. And maybe that's the lesson I want to leave you with. If you've ever been pushed aside, if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the very people who should have protected you, know this: your silence does not mean you are weak. Your survival does not mean you are lesser. Sometimes the very act of existing in spite of their attempts to erase you is the loudest declaration you can make. They erased me. I endured. And when the truth came, I didn't need to fight. I just needed to be. So if you're still listening, if you've carried the weight of being overlooked, dismissed, or erased, hear me now. You are not invisible. You are not small. And the day will come when the truth, whatever your truth may be, will speak louder than their judgment. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever fought your way back from being erased, I want you to do something for me. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment made you realize your worth. Because your story matters as much as mine, and together, we can remind each other that silence is not weakness. It is the space where strength is born.